Chapter 7, Social Class and Classism. Okay, so social classifications may be used to assign social roles, and they can be based on gender, age, race, ethnicity, ability, knowledge, or education. These can be a way of designating rank and power or social class status as well. And social classifications and markers can vary widely within and between cultures across time. So some different ways to conceptualize social class structure would be quantifiable factors, and those are things like educational attainment, type of employment, income level, savings, investments, housing, and property ownership. And then we also have subjective factors, so that's how an individual perceives and experiences their own socioeconomic status in relation to others. So we have some terms that are associated with class status, and you're likely going to hear many of these in your counseling sessions. So for lower class status, we have terms like low income, lower class, working poor, urban or rural poor, welfare recipient, high school dropout, and manual labor. And then for middle class status, you may hear terms like middle income, middle class, working class, professional, homeowners, high school graduate, and skilled laborer. And then for upper class status, you may hear things like upper income, upper class, wealthy, new money, old money, college graduate, and executive. So it's important to keep in mind that even though most of these terms are generally accepted and they're used pretty often, some of them may covertly reference and perpetuate negative stereotypes. So that's something to really keep in mind in terms of language. We've talked about that before. Language is very important, not only your own, because your biases may come out through your language and you may not even realize it, but also your client's language. And if you hear them saying certain words or terms over and over again, and that may be leading into some more negative thoughts that are being reinforced by repeating this language, that can be something that you can work on with your client as well. So keep that in mind. So socioeconomic status, SES. So you'll hear me say the word SES a lot. I guess it's not really a word, but the acronym SES, and that's what I'm referring to because socioeconomic status is kind of a mouthful. So we have low, middle, or upper SES, and this doesn't automatically correlate with income level, so it's something to keep in mind. So net worth, that's based on the sum of assets, so like cash, investments, that kind of thing, minus liability, so debt, mortgage. So keep in mind that you could have someone who has a ton of assets and they may seem like they're upper level, right? But then they have a ton of debt, a ton of mortgages. So not necessarily what it looks like on the surface, right? So keep that in mind with your clients too. Poverty, this is a condition in which a person's liabilities outweigh their assets and or they are unable to meet basic requirements for their well-being. And then wealth, so surplus of net worth, able to meet basic needs, and then accumulate resources above and beyond those basic needs. So this influences the counselor and the client due to prejudice and discrimination, and it affects the client's attitudes towards counseling, the counselor's perceptions of the client, and case conceptualization and interventions, as well as service options. So these are all things that we need to keep in mind when we enter a counseling relationship. So what is classism? The definition from the textbook is that this is discriminatory beliefs about and behavior towards individuals based on perceived or actual SES. So these biases shape our sense of self, our relationships, and our worldview. So I just touched on that a moment ago, like when you're thinking about cognitive therapy, that kind of thing. So one's schema, one's way of viewing who they are and their environment, their worldview, their schema. So internalized classism, this would be unexamined class biases which shape beliefs about ourselves and our merit in our families, our peer groups, and our community. So one may feel diminished or accomplished or superior compared to others. Another thing to think about is structural classism. So this is social and institutional practices that discriminate based on SES. So it's largely ignored due to psychological distancing. So this would be like ways of thinking and behaving that are used by privileged groups to distance themselves from their roles and economic injustice. So we can think of like cognitive dissonance as well, that kind of thing. When our behaviors don't match up with our ideas or the way we view things, then we're going to want to change our view to match our behavior so we don't feel as bad. So poverty attribution, that's how individuals explain poverty. Understanding of wealth and power is influenced by race, gender, education, and political and religious affiliation. So it's something to keep in mind as well. So the evolution of the social class, and this is in terms of the 19th century European transition from agricultural societies to more urban industrial societies. So we had upper class individuals who were the ones that owned materials and production. And then we had the working class individuals, and those were the ones who provided the labor, and they were paid minimally. So James Truslow Adams was the one who coined the term the American Dream, and this was in his book, The Epic of America, in 1933. So I have a very long quote here, but it sums it up. So this is referring to that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. It is a difficult dream for the European upper classes to interpret adequately, and too many of us ourselves have grown weary and mistrustful of it. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. So, this cultural mythology that the United States is a classless society with equal opportunity for all is what we view the American dream as now. So something that's not really possible. So statistics on income, employment, education, and healthcare actually indicate otherwise, that, like I said, it's not possible. The transition from a manufacturing economy to a service economy has created an underclass of chronically underemployed citizens. So that's what I'm referring to by this idea that some people just can't really get out. We don't see class mobility, which is what we're about to talk about. Okay, so in the United States, class distinctions are primarily based on financial status, income source, educational attainment, and occupation. So we could think that each economic tier has its own within group status markers. So like the wealthy, inherited versus earned wealth. With middle class, we have status equated with residence in higher performing public school districts. And within the lower SES, we have status being associated with mode of transportation or reliance on public assistance. So those who have their own car versus those who have to take the bus. We'll see with those within group status markers as well. Although the United States is a wealthy nation, the distribution of wealth is inequitable, and the distribution of wealth has steadily increased. So like the wealthiest 1% hold more than 1/3 of the total U.S. net worth, and nearly 2/3 of wealth within this country is held by the top 5%. So we see a huge difference between the haves and the have-nots, right? There's actually a very small percentage of individuals who are the haves. So class mobility, that's the degree to which individuals can move between class levels in a society. So typically we think of this as someone moving up the ranks. So there's an inverse association here between inequality and economic mobility at the country level, excluding the United States. So we have the birth lottery. This is the idea that geographic areas with better residential racial integration, income equality, public schools, and family stability facilitate greater class mobility. So the standard of living for middle and lower income households is stagnating or declining between generations as well. As cost of food, housing, healthcare, and a college education increases, we see more downward mobility among the classes as opposed to what we typically think of that people would move up the ranks. We're actually seeing more people moving down. So the history of class structure. White Europeans who colonized North America brought class structure with them. So they brought this idea. The wealthiest continue to be US-born white males, and the poorest are women, children, and people of color. So during periods of social upheaval or economic decline, anti-foreigner sentiments tend to rise, and this is often directed at recent immigrants. So if you're interested in like personality, that kind of thing, we tend to see that during periods of social upheaval, people as a whole tend to become more closed in nature, so not wanting to open up, wanting to kind of hunker down and be safe, that kind of thing. Being less open, so the personality trait openness, right? So with that, you see viewing outsiders as not something that you want to let in because you want to keep yourself safe, if that makes sense. So we see that as a whole. We see people becoming more conservative as the economy gets worse and more issues take place and more social upheaval takes place, and if there's more things like an epidemic, right, that kind of thing, we tend to see people becoming more conservative with their political views, that kind of stuff. And if you're interested in that, Jordan Peterson does a pretty good podcast, I suppose, or YouTube video, something like that, on personality traits and how they are affected by the environment. So targeting an other requires some means of an other identification based on visible, so race-based characteristics, clothing style, that kind of thing, or audible, like speech patterns and accents differences. So in order to target another, there has to be another, basically. And exclusion through profiling contributes to economic disenfranchisement and perpetuation of classist stereotypes. So we just see this structure being perpetuated. So poverty has been associated with higher incidences of mental disorders, more severe symptoms, and greater difficulty accessing services. So worldwide, people living in poverty experience twice the incidence of common mental disorders, things like anxiety and depression, that kind of thing. So twice the incidence as wealthy individuals. Poverty can be a causative factor, but it can also be a result of mental illness. So you see it kind of going both ways, and they kind of feed on each other. We see a greater incidence of exposure to violence and related trauma, depression, anxiety, and PTSD in poverty. And then higher exposure to pollutants in the air, water, and food as well. And then we also see that these individuals often have less access to books, computers, and tools for learning, so they're less likely to be able to develop coping skills, that kind of thing. So, who is poor? The national poverty rate is currently at its highest level since 1993. So 15.1% of those in the United States are living in poverty right now. In 2010, the federal poverty threshold for a family of 3 was $17,374, and a family of 4, it was $22,314. So the average poverty rates for racial and ethnic minorities are as follows. We have Black individuals at about 27%, Hispanic origin, any race, at 26%, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders at about 12%, and then Asian at about 12% as well. And we also see that with women and children, especially women and children from racial minority groups, there's an overrepresentation of those who are poor in the United States. So food insecurity. This is a term used by the United States government to refer to reduced quality of diet, disrupted eating patterns, and reduced food intake. In 2010, 14% of U.S. households experienced food insecurity. And the highest rates among households below federal poverty line is with single women with children and Black and Latino households. Households with food insecure children are likely to include at least one working adult, so 85% are employed at least part-time, and then 70% full-time workers. Less than half of those adults have an educational level beyond high school. Food scarcity has been linked with developmental and social delays in children, lowered immune system functioning, obesity, emotional and behavioral problems, mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and aggression. So this is something to keep in mind as well. You want to try to feel for this if you have clients who you think, you suspect maybe, or you know are of lower income status. You want to check in and see if they do have food, if they have this resource, and if they don't, advocating for them and giving them resources so that they can get food. You also, so when you're doing your case conceptualization paper, comes to mind right now. Something you might want to think about, like if you chose the child with ADHD, for example. So ADHD type symptoms, you see in children these behavioral symptoms, acting out, hyperactivity, not paying attention, blah, blah, blah. You tend to see it more with males, right? Because they, at that age range, are starting to show more behavioral symptoms, while females are starting to show more internalized symptoms, so like depression, anxiety. If they're dealing with something at home or at school, those are the symptom pools. They kind of you see that shift there between the genders with their symptom pools. That's what I'm getting at. So, say you have a child who comes in and they're experiencing these behavioral symptoms, and you are trying to conceptualize what might be going on. Why are they having all of these behavioral issues? Well, something that might be coming up is food insecurity. If it's a lower income child, maybe they're not getting the resources they need, the correct foods they need, nutrition. You can take it a step further. Maybe they don't feel safe, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that kind of thing. Basic needs aren't being met. Maybe they don't feel safe at home. They can't sleep because they hear gunshots, or they don't have heat or AC. And it goes on and on. So that's kind of what I'm getting at also when it comes to your case conceptualization papers, to think more about things like that. So thinking outside of the box more holistically about your client's environment while you conceptualize them. Okay, so and then we have education. So profound inequalities in school facilities, teacher salaries, and teacher materials may take place when you think about income. So those who are lower income, school facilities tend to have less funding. The teachers tend to therefore have less of a salary, so it may be less competitive. You may see more of teachers going to those schools as their first job to get some experience, that's the word, sorry, to get some experience, and then they're just jumping ship afterwards. So you see a high turnaround rate as well. So all of those things can affect kids within the education system. So Serrano versus Priest, 1971, there was demand for more equitable systems of taxation and allocation. 1 out of every 17 students from the poorest families will get into college, and their families will spend about 25% of their household income on that college education. So that's something else to think about as well. Whether you have a college student that you're counseling, anything that comes along with that, knowing that their parents are spending 25% of their income. So any guilt, shame, anxiety, depression, that kind of stuff. Also, they may be working to help pay for schooling. So that can be very stressful for a college student. And then you also have to think about it in terms of the adult clients you may have. Maybe they have a child in college, or maybe they have a child in high school and they're starting to stress out thinking about how am I going to pay for college in a few years. So always thinking outside of the box with your clients. Minority race children are overrepresented in the poor schools, so that's another thing to keep in mind as well. When it comes to employment, educational attainment and employment opportunities are closely linked in perpetuating generational class oppression. So we tend to see that generational cycle. In May of 2007, Congress approved a bill to increase the federal minimum wage for the first time since 1997. Creating a livable wage is being encouraged, and we've seen and heard about this in the media lately that they're considering increasing the minimum wage again. So employment in general is becoming increasingly unstable and wages have stagnated. And that's why they're considering an option of increasing minimum wage. Safe and affordable housing. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in housing rentals, sales, and mortgage lending on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or handicap. And public housing is being demolished these days and being replaced by more of like mixed income housing units. And it's important to keep in mind that this may actually be unaffordable for a lot of individuals who are in the lower income bracket. So you may see that with some of your clients as well. And this may lead to higher rates of homelessness also. So housing quality and community safety have been found in research to have a positive correlation with mental health, which just makes sense. It's like those basic needs I referenced earlier, Maslow's hierarchy. Um, if you're if you feel safe, your community's safe, you have housing, you have a roof over your head, then you're naturally going to feel better mentally, right? You'll have less mental health issues, well, not necessarily less mental health issues, but you'll have more mental health issues if you don't have those things. Health insurance. So the United States remains one of the few developed countries without universal health care. In 2014, about 10% of the US population had no health insurance coverage. And we do see a slight racial and ethnic discrepancy in coverage rates. So we have the Affordable Care Act, although I think that this has been altered recently in the last few years. So I'm not sure what's going on there right now. I think they're trying to make up their mind. The US healthcare system as a whole, it's important to think about, is the most expensive in the world, while it's also ranking near the bottom in terms of access, efficiency, and equity. So for clients that you may have, which I've seen this a lot, so I'm sure you will as well, a lot of clients having multiple issues. So not only psychiatric issues, but also medical issues. And I've had many clients that I've needed to advocate for, sit down and help them with paperwork, that kind of thing, trying to find resources. And health insurance is one of those things that you may find yourself spending time with your client working on. So that's one of the questions that I reference, I believe, in the case conceptualization as well, is do you find yourself doing different things for some clients, or spending more time working on things you wouldn't have with another client? So that's kind of what I'm referencing. I've seen myself sometimes spending time doing paperwork and helping a client out, that kind of thing. The degree to which we are satisfied or dissatisfied with our SES relative to others may influence health outcomes. So, psychological consequences of feeling devalued and displaced include humiliation, lowered efficacy, low self esteem, and higher rates of suicide. The ability to externalize classism, identify structural causes, and take effective action contributes to positive stress coping and resiliency. So counselors need to understand the evolving perceptions of class and the relationship between social class and mental health counseling over time. Something to keep in mind is that low SES clients do have the highest treatment dropout rates. So they have greater difficulty in accessing services. Services are of lower quality, and they're more likely to be admitted to psychiatric hospitals involuntarily. Another thing to keep in mind is that teachers and school administrators tend to have lower expectations of children and parents who are poor. Counselors may assume people with pressing resource concerns cannot benefit from insight or process type therapies until issues with inadequate resources are alleviated. So you tend to see that as well. Think about the hierarchy of needs. So we assume that an individual needs to meet that basic need before we can go any further. Certainly before self-actualization, that kind of thing. So there may be less likelihood to use an existential type therapy or any type of insight focused therapy with a client who is of low SES. So that's one of a bias that may come up in counseling. Counselors may ignore resource stressors. That's another thing to keep in mind. And they should develop their awareness, knowledge, and skills regarding classism in counseling. So once again, this is kind of being repeated, this idea of awareness, knowledge, and skills. So with awareness, cognitive dissonance again. So this is a state of psychological disequilibrium experienced when we face and have not resolved information that contradicts our worldview. So activities that will provide counselors with several opportunities for increasing their awareness can be helpful. One example is writing your own class story. So that's kind of getting into what we're doing in this class, only I want the ancestry paper to cover all of the subgroups that you have, so all of your entire profile, not just classism. Volunteer, interact with other social classes, educate yourself, interview professionals in your field, complete a class privilege inventory, and explore your social class. With the knowledge piece, counselors should explore theory that integrates class and classism. So we have feminist theory, womanist theory, relational cultural theory, or RCT, and then social class worldview model. So it's SCWM. Counselors should also become more knowledgeable about needs and concerns of poor and low-income individuals through informational interviews and community status reports. And then counselors should increase their knowledge of community resources by both identifying and investigating them. And then with the skills piece, the importance of client and self-assessment of counselor values and biases that emerge, a comprehensive initial assessment of the client's context, and the presenting concerns, explore clients' values and beliefs about social class, resource stressors and strengths, include any concerns or goals, pay attention to psychological symptoms, and assess the client's awareness of classism, racism, and gender oppression. And then the last piece is advocacy. So here, this is a collective response to social injustice. It's a normal and necessary element of counseling, so I'm sure you've noticed I say advocacy quite a bit when it comes to counseling and working with your clients. At the professional level, it includes self-care, integrated services, counselor training and research. At the individual level, it's attending to basic needs. And at the community level, it includes empowerment, education, training, public policy, and universal health insurance. So that is the end of this chapter on social class and classism.